Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever. Sometimes all it takes is one person who decides to stop and help. Mountain man Caleb Stone was riding across the plains at sundown when he saw her, a lone woman, hammering away at a broken cabin, her hands bleeding, her spirit unbroken. Most men would have kept riding. The frontier was no place for sentiment. But something in her determination made Caleb dismount and pick up a hammer. That single choice would set both their lives on a path neither saw coming. What made a man who'd spent 15 years alone in the wilderness risk everything for a stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Stone had been many things in his 43 years. A son, a husband, a lawman, a homesteader. But for the last 15 years, he'd been nothing more than a shadow moving through the mountains of Wyoming territory, a man who preferred the company of pine trees and elk to people. The high country suited him. It asked no questions. It made no demands beyond the basic requirements of survival. Up there, in the thin air where eagles nested and snow lingered into July, a man could forget, or at least, he could try. He'd come down from the mountains 3 days prior, his pack horse laden with beaver pelts and fox furs, destined for the trading post in Lodgepole. It was his twice-yearly ritual, the only time he ventured near civilization. He'd trade his furs for supplies, coffee, ammunition, salt, tobacco, and then disappear back into the wilderness before anyone could engage him in more than the most necessary conversation. The trader, an old German named Klaus, had learned long ago not to press Caleb with questions or idle talk. Money changed hands, goods were exchanged, and Caleb would be gone before sunset. But this trip had been different. Klaus had been laid up with a broken leg, and his daughter Margrethe minded the store. She'd been friendly, chatty even, asking about his health and whether he'd had a good season. Caleb had answered in monosyllables, eager to conclude his business and leave. Yet something in her kindness had unsettled him, like a stone dropped into a still pond. It reminded him of a time when such simple human warmth had been part of his daily life. Now, riding across the open plains as the sun descended toward the distant mountains, Caleb felt that same unsettled feeling. The sky was ablaze with color, deep oranges bleeding into purples and reds, the kind of sunset that made a man stop and take notice whether he wanted to or not. His horse, a sturdy roan mare named Dust, picked her way across the scrub grass with the patient gait of an animal that knew her rider was in no particular hurry. The plains stretched out in all directions, vast and empty. Or so Caleb thought until movement caught his eye. He reined Dust to a halt, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Out here, caution kept a man alive. But as his eyes focused on the distant figure, his hand relaxed. Not a threat, just a person. A woman, by the looks of it, working at something near a half-collapsed structure. Caleb sat motionless, watching. The structure was a cabin, or had been once. Now it was little more than a skeleton, 3 walls standing, one collapsed entirely, the roof sagging dangerously to one side. And there, in the failing light, a lone woman swung a hammer at a beam that clearly had no intention of cooperating. Even from this distance, Caleb could see her determination in every movement, the way she adjusted her grip and swung again when the first blow failed to drive the nail home. He should ride on. It was the sensible thing to do. The sun was setting, and he had miles to cover before he could make camp in a decent spot. Besides, whatever troubles that woman faced were her own. The frontier was harsh, and everyone who lived out here knew the terms. You survived on your own merit, your own strength, your own will. Help was a luxury few could afford to give or receive. Yet Caleb didn't move. He sat there on Dust, watching the woman work as shadows lengthened across the plains. There was something in her persistence that spoke to him, something that reached past his carefully constructed walls of solitude. She wasn't giving up. The cabin was barely standing, her tools were inadequate, and darkness was coming, but she kept swinging that hammer. It reminded him of Sarah. The thought came unbidden, and with it a wave of memories he usually kept locked away. Sarah, working their garden in the early morning light, her dark hair pulled back, dirt under her fingernails, humming softly as she planted seeds. Sarah, laughing at his clumsy attempts to fix the chair he'd broken. Sarah, stubbornly insisting she could help him frame their barn, even in her 6th month of pregnancy, her determination overriding his protests. Sarah, who died giving birth to their daughter. The daughter who'd lived only 3 hours, just long enough for Caleb to hold her tiny hand and watch her take her last breath. He closed his eyes against the memory, against the pain that even 15 years couldn't fully diminish. When he opened them again, the woman was still there, still working, still refusing to yield to the encroaching darkness. Caleb's jaw tightened. He told himself to ride on. Told himself that getting involved in someone else's struggle would only bring complication and pain. Told himself that he'd left that part of his life behind, the part where he cared, where he helped, where he allowed himself to feel anything beyond the simple rhythm of survival. But his hands, seemingly of their own accord, guided dust forward. The mare responded without hesitation, carrying him across the plains toward the failing cabin and the woman who refused to abandon it. As they drew closer, Caleb could see more details. The woman was younger than he'd thought, perhaps not yet 30. Her dress was worn and patched, her hair the color of honey in the sunset light, escaping from a braid that had long since given up any pretense of organization. Her hands, he noticed as he drew alongside the cabin, were bleeding. Raw and blistered, they gripped the hammer with a determination that bordered on desperation. She hadn't noticed him yet, so focused was she on her task. Caleb dismounted slowly, quietly, not wanting to startle her. He tied dust to what remained of a fence post and stood for a moment, watching. The woman raised the hammer again, brought it down, missed the nail entirely, and let out a sound of pure frustration. Without a word, Caleb walked to where a pile of timber lay scattered in the dirt. He selected a straight piece, tested its weight, and carried it to the wall she was trying to repair. He set it in place, holding it steady with one hand while reaching for a nail from the pouch at his belt. The woman spun around, hammer raised like a weapon, her eyes wide with shock and fear. They stared at each other in the dying light, this woman with her bleeding hands and fierce determination, and this man who'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of moment. "Ma'am," Caleb said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, "this beam needs 2 people. I'll hold if you'll hammer." For a long moment, she didn't move. He could see her weighing her options, calculating the risk. A lone woman on the frontier learned to be cautious, learned that trust could kill you as surely as a rattlesnake or a winter storm. But then her eyes flickered to the beam he was holding, to the cabin that was more ruin than shelter, to the darkness that was coming whether she was ready or not. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "All right." They worked in silence as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. Caleb held timbers while she nailed them in place. When her arms grew too tired to swing the hammer effectively, he took it from her without asking, and she held the board steady. They moved around each other with the careful courtesy of strangers, but with each nail driven home, each board secured, something shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of it. The recognition that sometimes survival meant accepting help, and sometimes healing meant offering it. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the plains in shades of gold and amber. Caleb woke to find himself still at the cabin, his bedroll spread beneath a cottonwood tree some 20 yards from where the woman slept inside the partially repaired structure. He hadn't planned to stay. Had told himself he'd work until full dark and then ride on, make camp a few miles distant. But somehow the night had passed with him here, keeping watch without quite admitting that's what he was doing. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold ground, and walked to where dust was hobbled. The mare nickered softly, and Caleb ran a hand along her neck, taking comfort in her solid warmth. Smoke rose from the cabin's makeshift chimney. The woman was awake then. He should saddle up and leave before she emerged, before awkward morning conversations could take place. That would be the sensible thing. Instead, he found himself gathering wood for the fire. The cabin door opened as he approached with an armful of split logs, and the woman stepped out into the morning light. She looked different in daylight, still young, still worn by hardship, but there was strength in her face that the shadows had hidden. Her honey-colored hair was neatly braided now, and she'd wrapped her damaged hands in clean cloth. "You're still here," she said, and Caleb couldn't quite read her tone. Surprise, certainly, but also something else. Relief, maybe. "Saw you needed wood," he replied, moving past her to stack the logs beside the door. "I have coffee," she offered. "It's not much, but it's hot." Caleb hesitated, every instinct telling him to decline, to mount up and ride out while he still could. But the smell of coffee drifted from the cabin, and he realized he hadn't tasted proper coffee in 3 days. Klaus's daughter had offered him some at the trading post, but he'd been too eager to leave to accept. "Coffee would be good," he heard himself say. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A bedroll in one corner, a small trunk, a makeshift table fashioned from boards and tree stumps. The fire crackled in a stone hearth that looked recently repaired. The woman poured coffee into 2 tin cups, and they sat across from each other at the table, the silence stretching between them. "I'm Emma," she said finally. "Emma Crawford. Caleb Stone. Thank you, Mr. Stone. For last night, I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped." Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm cup, studying the dark liquid rather than meeting her eyes. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not managing at all, Mr. Stone. I'm barely surviving." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "My husband died 6 months ago. Logging accident up in the hills. He'd spent 2 years building this cabin, getting ready for us to start our life here. It was his dream. Good land, good water, room to grow." She gestured to the walls around them. He'd just finished the roof when the tree fell wrong. Caleb felt the familiar weight of grief settle over the conversation. He knew that weight, carried it with him every day. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "Everyone's sorry," Emma replied. "Sorry doesn't fix a cabin or plant a field or keep the wolves away at night." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I apologize. That was unkind. You've been nothing but helpful, and here I am being bitter. You've earned some bitterness." Emma looked at him then, really looked at him, and Caleb felt exposed under her gaze. "You've lost someone too," she said softly. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. They drank their coffee as the sun climbed higher, and gradually Emma told him more. How she'd been living with her sister in Lodgepole after her husband Thomas died. How her brother-in-law had made it clear she was a burden, another mouth to feed. How she'd decided to come back to the cabin, to finish what Thomas had started, even though everyone told her she was mad. A woman alone on the frontier, trying to homestead. It was suicide, they said. She'd be dead before winter. "Maybe they're right," Emma admitted, "but at least I'll die trying to honor his memory. That's worth something, isn't it?" Caleb thought of Sarah, of the homestead he'd abandoned, of the life he'd let slip away. "Yes," he said, "it's worth something." He meant to leave after breakfast, told himself he'd check the roof one more time, make sure it would hold, and then ride on. But as he climbed up to inspect his previous night's work, he spotted something that made his stomach sink. The main support beam was cracked not badly, but enough that the next strong wind would bring the whole roof down. "Problem?" Emma called from below. "Beam's cracked. Won't hold a strong wind, much less snow come winter." Emma's face fell. "Can it be fixed?" Caleb studied the damage, calculating. Need to reinforce it. Couple days' work, maybe 3. I can't ask you to stay that long. You didn't ask. The words came out before he could stop them, before he could think about what he was committing to. But that roof will kill you if the beam gives way. Can't leave it like that. Something passed across Emma's face, gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that made Caleb uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. Just a couple more days, he added, as much to reassure himself as her. Then I'll be on my way. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. They worked through the morning, Caleb cutting and shaping a support beam, while Emma cleared debris and sorted through Thomas's tools. Around midday, Caleb felt it, a change in the air, a particular quality to the light that any man who'd spent years in the wilderness would recognize. He straightened, scanning the horizon, and his suspicions were confirmed. Dark clouds were building to the west, moving fast. Storm coming, he said. Emma looked up, following his gaze. How long? Few hours, maybe less. And it's going to be bad. They both understood what that meant. The cabin was barely standing as it was. A strong storm would tear it apart, leaving Emma with nothing. All of Thomas's work, all of her desperate hope, scattered across the plains like so much kindling. We have to finish, Emma said, her voice tight. We have to make it weatherproof. Can't finish properly in a few hours. Then we make it good enough. Her eyes met his, fierce and determined. Please, Mr. Stone, help me save this. It's all I have left of him. Caleb looked at the approaching storm, at the half-finished cabin, at this woman who'd already lost so much and stood to lose the rest. Every practical bone in his body told him it was impossible. The smart move was to gather what could be carried and ride for Lodgepole, get Emma to safety, and let the cabin go. But he thought of Sarah, of the dreams they'd had, of the life they'd been building when death had stolen it away. If someone could have saved even a piece of that, could have helped him preserve something of what they'd made together, wouldn't he have fought for it with everything he had? All right, he said, we'll do what we can. What followed was a race against nature itself. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and electricity. They worked with desperate efficiency, Caleb on the roof, securing beams and hammering down loose boards, while Emma passed up materials and held ladders steady. They spoke in short, urgent bursts, all excess conversation stripped away by necessity. The first drops of rain began to fall as Caleb hammered the final nail into a sheet of tin roofing he'd salvaged from Thomas's pile. The wind was gusting now, strong enough to make the ladder sway, and Emma gripped it with white-knuckled hands. "Get inside!" Caleb shouted over the rising storm. "Not without you." He shinned down the ladder as the rain intensified, transforming in seconds from scattered drops to a solid wall of water. They stumbled into the cabin together, slamming the door against the wind. Outside, the storm unleashed its full fury. Thunder cracked so loud it felt like the earth itself was splitting, and lightning illuminated the cabin's interior in stark flashes of white. They stood there, dripping and panting, as the storm raged around them. The walls creaked and groaned, the roof shuddered, but it held. They'd done it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd done it. Emma started to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that spoke of relief and exhaustion and disbelief, all tangled together. Caleb found himself smiling despite his better judgment, caught up in the absurdity and triumph of the moment. "We did it," Emma said, her voice breaking. "We actually did it." Then, without warning, she was crying. Great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Caleb stood frozen, uncertain, as she sank down onto her trunk and buried her face in her bandaged hands. He'd spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of raw human emotion, 15 years keeping himself separate from anything that might require him to feel or respond or care. But now, watching this woman break down after holding herself together through impossible circumstances, he found he couldn't just stand there. Slowly, awkwardly, he crossed the small space and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, barely anything at all, but Emma reached up and gripped his hand like it was a lifeline. They stayed that way as the storm pounded against the walls they'd built together, as the rain drummed against the roof they'd saved. Two people who'd been alone, finding something like comfort in each other's presence, and Caleb realized, with a feeling that was equal parts fear and wonder, that he'd stopped thinking about leaving. Outside, the storm would rage for hours. But inside the cabin something else was beginning, something neither of them had planned for, something that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The inciting incident wasn't just the storm or the cabin or the desperate work. It was this moment, this connection, this crack in the armor Caleb had spent 15 years building, and somewhere deep down, in a place he'd thought was dead, something began to stir back to life. The second day of travel brought them within sight of Caleb's old homestead. He'd tried to prepare himself, but when the familiar outline of the valley came into view, his chest constricted so tightly he could barely breathe. Emma, perceptive as always, noticed his distress immediately. "Caleb," she said softly, "what is it?" He couldn't speak at first, could only stare at the depression between two low hills where he'd built his life with Sarah. The homestead was too far to see details, but he didn't need to. Every board, every stone, every inch of that place was burned into his memory. "My place," he finally managed. "Mine and Sarah's. It's just over that rise." Emma looked from the hills to Caleb's face, reading the pain there. "Do you want to stop? We could camp here, approach Lodgepole from a different direction." The offer was tempting, but Caleb shook his head. Emma had been right the night before. Running from pain only gave it more power. "No, I need to see it, need to know if it's still standing, or if time took it like it takes everything." They rode slowly toward the valley, and with each step, more details emerged. The cabin was still there, weathered and worn, but structurally sound. Someone had maintained it, at least minimally. The barn had partially collapsed, but the main house stood proud against the sky. Sarah's garden plot was overgrown with sage and prairie grass, but Caleb could still make out its borders, could still see where they'd planned to expand it. They stopped at the edge of the property, and Caleb sat motionless on dust, overwhelmed by memory. He could see Sarah hanging laundry on the line that was no longer there, could hear her singing as she worked, could smell the bread she'd bake every Saturday, filling the cabin with warmth and comfort. "Tell me about it," Emma said quietly. "Tell me about your life here." So Caleb did. He pointed to where the barn had stood fully intact, where he'd kept their 2 cows and a handful of chickens. He showed her the creek that ran through the property, the same creek where Sarah had done washing and where he'd taught their future children to fish, in the dreams they'd shared on warm summer evenings. He told her about the winter they'd spent snowed in, how Sarah had insisted on reading to him every night from the few books they owned, how they'd played checkers by firelight and talked about the family they'd raise in this place. "We were going to have 5 children," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah was convinced. 3 boys and 2 girls. She had names picked out for all of them. Thomas, after her father, Michael and John, Mary and Rose. He paused. "We only got to Rose." Emma reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it anchored him, kept him from being swept away by the tide of grief. "It was a good life," Emma said. "Brief, but good. That matters." "I abandoned it," Caleb replied. "Left it all behind because I couldn't face it." "You survived the only way you knew how. There's no shame in that." They sat in silence for a long moment, then Caleb made a decision that surprised even himself. "I want to see inside, just for a moment." They dismounted and approached the cabin together, Emma staying close but giving him space to process. The door hung slightly askew, but opened easily. Inside, the space was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but it was remarkably intact. Someone had clearly used it as a way station or shelter over the years, but they'd respected the space, hadn't vandalized or destroyed. The table Caleb had built still stood near the window. Sarah's rocking chair, made by her grandfather, sat in the corner where she'd placed it. The pot-bellied stove they'd scrimped and saved to buy still dominated one wall. It was all there, preserved like a monument to a life that had ended before it had really begun. Caleb walked slowly through the space, touching familiar objects, remembering. He opened the trunk where they'd kept their clothes and found some of Sarah's things still there, a shawl she'd worn, a bonnet, a pair of gloves. He held them gently, breathing in, hoping to catch some trace of her scent. But there was nothing except dust and time. "Caleb," Emma said from near the hearth, "look at this." She was holding something, a journal, leather-bound and well-worn. Caleb crossed to her and took it, recognizing it immediately. She'd written in it nearly every day, recording her thoughts and dreams and the small details of their daily life. His hands trembled as he opened it, and Sarah's handwriting greeted him like a voice from beyond the grave. The entries were mundane: weather observations, lists of chores, notes about their animals. But woven through them was Sarah's essential optimism, her unwavering faith that everything would work out well in the end. He flipped to the last entries, from the weeks before she died, and there, in her careful script, he read, "The baby kicks so strongly now, she's eager to meet the world, I think." Caleb felt her move today and got the most wonderful smile on his face. He'll be such a good father. I know he worries about being strong enough, capable enough, good enough, but he's already all those things and more. I see it in how gentle he is with me, how carefully he tends to everything we're building here. I'm so grateful that this is the man I chose, the man who chose me. Whatever comes, I know we'll face it together, and our daughter will know she's loved every single day of her life. Caleb's vision blurred as tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in 15 years finally broke free. Emma moved to him, wrapping her arms around him as he wept for Sarah, for their daughter, for all the lost years and lost possibilities. "She knew you loved her," Emma murmured. "She knew, Caleb." When the storm of grief finally passed, Caleb felt different. Lighter somehow, as if the tears had washed away some of the weight he'd been carrying. He carefully placed the journal in his saddlebag, a piece of Sarah to carry with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the good that had been. They rode toward Lodgepole in the afternoon light, and though Caleb's heart was still heavy, it was no longer crushed. Seeing the homestead hadn't destroyed him as he'd feared. Instead, it had given him something unexpected. Permission. Permission to remember Sarah with joy instead of only pain. Permission to honor what they'd had without being imprisoned by its loss. Permission, perhaps, to imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by the past. As they approached the outskirts of town, Emma broke their comfortable silence. "Thank you for sharing that with me, for trusting me with something so precious." "Thank you for being there," Caleb replied. "I don't think I could have faced it alone. You're stronger than you think. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally tired of being alone." Emma smiled, and in that smile, Caleb saw understanding and something else, possibility. But before he could examine that feeling too closely, they crested the final rise, and lodgepoles spread out before them. The town was bigger than Caleb remembered, probably nearing 300 souls now. New buildings had sprung up along the main street, and there was even a church with a proper steeple. Progress had come to the frontier, while he'd hidden in the mountains. As they rode down the main street toward the trading post, Caleb noticed people staring. Some faces were familiar, though aged by the years. Others were new, but all of them were curious, and many were judgmental. An older woman actually turned her back as they passed, her disapproval clear as day. "Mrs. Henderson," Emma said quietly, "one of Thomas's distant relations. She never approved of our marriage, thought Thomas could do better." "Her opinion doesn't matter," Caleb said. "In a small town, everyone's opinion matters." They tied their horses outside Klaus's trading post, and Caleb felt a flutter of anxiety. He'd traded here for years, but always quickly, keeping conversation minimal. Now he was arriving with a woman, and people would talk, would assume things, would spread gossip that could damage Emma's reputation. "Emma," he started, but she held up a hand. "I know what I'm doing, Caleb. I made this choice with my eyes open." She met his gaze steadily. "You've helped me more than I can ever repay. If people want to think poorly of me for accepting that help, that's their burden to carry, not mine." Her courage shamed him. Here he was, worried about gossip, while Emma faced potential social ruin with her head held high. He offered her his arm, and together they walked into the trading post. Klaus's daughter Margaret was behind the counter, and her eyes widened when she saw them. "Mr. Stone, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. And Mrs. Crawford, how are you? We heard about Thomas. Such a tragedy." "Thank you, Margaret," Emma replied with dignity. "I'm managing. Actually, that's why we're here. I need supplies." As Emma began discussing her needs with Margaret, Caleb wandered the store, ostensibly looking at goods, but actually listening to the murmured conversations happening near the door. 3 men had entered behind them, and their voices carried clearly in the small space. "That's Emma Crawford, ain't it? The widow." "Yep. And that's Caleb Stone with her. Used to be marshal hereabouts, before he went strange and took to the mountains." "Strange is right. What's he doing with her? They ain't married." "Use your imagination, Frank. Young widow, older man, 2 days on the trail. Don't take much figuring." Caleb's jaw tightened, anger building in his chest. He'd dealt with gossip and judgment before, but hearing them talk about Emma that way made his blood boil. He started toward the men, ready to defend her honor, but a hand on his arm stopped him. "Don't," Emma said quietly. She'd finished with Margaret and must have heard the conversation too. "They're not worth it. Let them think what they want. They're insulting you. They're revealing their own small minds. That's their problem, not ours." But before Caleb could respond, the door burst open and a man strode in with the confidence of someone who owned the place. He was tall, well-dressed for the frontier, with a carefully groomed beard and calculating eyes. 3 other men followed him, clearly hired muscle. "Emma Crawford," the man said, his voice smooth as oil. "I'd heard you were back at Thomas's cabin. Surprised to see you've survived this long." "Benjamin Hartwell," Emma replied, her voice cool. "I'm managing just fine, thank you." Hartwell's eyes slid to Caleb, assessing him in the way a predator sizes up potential threats. "And who's your friend?" "Don't recall seeing you around." "Caleb Stone." Something flickered in Hartwell's eyes, recognition maybe, or calculation. "Stone. I've heard that name. You used to be a marshal, didn't you?" "Used to be. Well, Mr. Used to be Marshal, I wonder if Emma has told you about our arrangement." Hartwell turned to Emma with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "About the land sale?" Emma's face paled. "There is no arrangement, Mr. Hartwell. I've told you repeatedly. Now, Emma, we've discussed this. Your late husband owed certain debts. The land is a fair settlement. Thomas didn't owe you anything. He paid for that land in full." "Prove it." Hartwell's smile widened. "Show me documentation." Emma's silence was answer enough. Caleb knew what that meant. The papers had likely been destroyed in a fire or simply never properly filed. On the frontier, many transactions were based on handshakes and trust, not legal documents. "That's what I thought," Hartwell continued. "So here's what's going to happen. You have 3 days to vacate the property. After that, my men will remove you forcibly if necessary." He tipped his hat in mock courtesy. "Good day, Mrs. Crawford, Mr. Stone." As Hartwell and his men left, Caleb felt everything click into place: the calculated cruelty, the legal manipulation, the predatory targeting of a vulnerable widow. He'd seen men like Hartwell before, men who used the law as a weapon against those who couldn't defend themselves. Emma stood frozen, her face ashen, and Caleb felt something inside him shift and harden. For 15 years he'd hidden from responsibility, from caring, from involvement in the messy complications of other people's lives. But looking at Emma's devastation, at the injustice being perpetrated against her, he felt his old martial instincts roar back to life. He'd run long enough, hidden long enough. It was time to stop being afraid of losing and start fighting for something worth keeping. And Emma Crawford, with her strength and her determination and her refusal to give up, was definitely worth fighting for. They gathered Emma's supplies in tense silence. The joy of their earlier journey completely evaporated. Caleb could see Emma struggling to maintain her composure, her hands shaking slightly as she paid Margaret for flour, salt, and coffee. The transaction complete, they loaded the goods onto the pack horse and prepared to leave town. "Wait here," Caleb said. "There's something I need to do." Before Emma could respond, he was already walking toward the largest building on the main street, the saloon that doubled as a hotel and meeting hall. If memory served, this was where the town's unofficial business got done, where deals were made and disputes were settled, and more importantly, it was where Benjamin Hartwell would likely be holding court. Caleb found him at a corner table, whiskey glass in hand, entertaining his men with some story that had them laughing roughly. When Hartwell saw Caleb approaching, his expression shifted from amusement to wariness. "Mr. Stone, come to plead your lady friend's case." "Come to hear yours," Caleb replied, pulling out a chair uninvited and sitting across from Hartwell. "This debt you claim Thomas Crawford owed, what was it for?" Hartwell leaned back, studying Caleb with calculating eyes. "Goods purchased on credit at my trading post up north. Total came to nearly $200. $200 for a homestead that size? That's steep. The land is worth what someone's willing to pay for it, and I'm willing to pay $200. Generous, considering Mrs. Crawford has no documentation proving ownership. Convenient that you're also the creditor and the buyer." Hartwell's smile hardened. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Stone. I see opportunities and I take them. Nothing illegal about that." "No," Caleb agreed. "But taking advantage of a widow might be legal without being right. Right doesn't build empires, Stone, and I didn't survive this long by letting sentiment cloud my judgment." Hartwell drained his whiskey and poured another. "But I'll tell you what. Since you seem so concerned about the widow's welfare, make me an offer. You buy the debt, you buy her problems. Otherwise, stay out of matters that don't concern you." Caleb stood slowly. "I think you'll find they concern me more than you realize." He left before Hartwell could respond, but not before catching the flash of concern in the man's eyes. Good. Let him wonder. Let him worry about what a former marshal might do when he decided to stop running from responsibility. Emma was waiting by the horses, her face tight with barely controlled emotion. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing that helped," Caleb admitted. "But I got a better sense of what we're dealing with. He's a predator, Emma. He's done this before, and he'll do it again, unless someone stops him." "How can we stop him? I have no papers, no proof. Thomas handled all that, and whatever documents he had burned in the fire last spring." Emma's voice cracked. "I should have been more careful, should have made copies, filed them properly. Now I'm going to lose everything because of my own carelessness." "You're not losing anything," Caleb said with more certainty than he felt. "There has to be a way to prove your ownership. Land office records, witnesses, something." They rode out of town as the sun began its descent, neither speaking much. The weight of Hartwell's threat hung over them, transforming what should have been a straightforward supply run into something far more serious. As they made camp that evening, at the same spring where they'd stopped on the way in, Emma finally broke down. "I can't fight him, Caleb. I don't have the money for lawyers, don't have the connections or the proof. He's going to take everything, and there's nothing I can do about it." Caleb poked at the fire, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. "When I was a marshal, I learned something important. Men like Hartwell count on people being too scared or too poor or too tired to fight back. They prey on the vulnerable because they think no one will stand up for them." He looked at Emma across the flames. But you're not alone anymore, and I'm not going to let him steal from you. Why? Emma's voice was soft, vulnerable. Why do you care so much? You could ride away tomorrow, back to your mountains, and none of this would touch you. It was a fair question, and Caleb owed her an honest answer. Because for 15 years I've been half alive, going through the motions of surviving but not really living. Because I was afraid to care, afraid to connect, afraid to risk losing something again. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But you've shown me something these past weeks. You've shown me that running from pain doesn't make it go away. It just makes you smaller, until there's almost nothing left of who you used to be. So this is about you needing to prove something to yourself? No. Caleb met her eyes. This is about me finally being honest enough to admit that I care about you, about what happens to you, about the life you're trying to build. He took a breath. I'm not saying this right. I'm out of practice at feeling things, at saying what matters. But Emma, these weeks with you have reminded me of who I used to be before grief hollowed me out, and I don't want to go back to those mountains. Don't want to go back to being alone. Emma's eyes glistened in the firelight. Caleb, I know it's too soon. Know you're still grieving, Thomas, and I'm still carrying Sarah with me everywhere I go. But maybe two broken people can help each other heal. Maybe we can build something new out of all these broken pieces. For a long moment, Emma didn't respond. Then she stood and crossed to his side of the fire, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. I started falling for you the moment you picked up that hammer, she said quietly, a stranger who stopped to help for no reason except that it was the right thing to do. That told me everything I needed to know about who you are. They sat together as the fire burned down to embers, not speaking, just being present with each other and with the possibilities opening up between them. It was peaceful and terrifying all at once, this vulnerability, this connection, this willingness to let someone matter again. So what do we do? Emma finally asked. About Hartwell? We fight, Caleb said simply. We go back to your cabin and we prepare. We find proof of your ownership if it exists. We gather witnesses. We document everything. And if that doesn't work, he paused, considering. If that doesn't work, we find another way. Legal if possible. You sound like a marshal again. Maybe I am again. Or maybe I'm just a man who's tired of watching injustice happen while he does nothing. They rode back to the cabin the next day, both of them hyper-aware that the clock was ticking. 3 days, Hartwell had said. 3 days to vacate or be forcibly removed. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. As they worked together that evening, preparing the cabin for whatever might come, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not just the simple purpose of daily survival, but something deeper. The sense that his life meant something, that his choices mattered, that he was part of something larger than his own solitary existence. He caught Emma watching him as he repaired a loose board on the door frame, and when their eyes met, she smiled. It was a small thing, that smile, but it carried weight. Trust, affection, hope. Caleb smiled back and realized that somewhere in the past weeks, without quite noticing when it happened, he'd stopped running. He'd stopped hiding from life and started living it again. And though the future was uncertain, though Hartwell's threat loomed large and the possibility of loss was real, Caleb found he didn't regret it. Because Emma was right. The pain of potential loss was only so great because what he stood to lose mattered so much. And after 15 years of feeling nothing, the sharp sting of caring was almost a relief. That night, as he lay near the fire one more time, Caleb pulled out his wooden box. He opened it slowly, looking at Sarah's belongings, at the physical remnants of a life they'd shared. And for the first time, he felt he could honor her memory without being destroyed by it, could carry her with him without letting grief be his only companion. I think you'd like her, he whispered to the darkness, to Sarah's memory. I think you'd understand. I hope you'd want this for me, this chance to live again, to care again, to maybe even love again." The night offered no answer, but Caleb felt a sense of peace settle over him nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Hartwell would need to be faced, Emma's land would need to be defended, and the future was anything but certain. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Caleb Stone felt ready to face whatever came, because he wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The next morning brought visitors. Caleb heard the horses before he saw them, 4 riders approaching from the east, backlit by the rising sun. He was outside checking the fence line he'd been repairing, and something in the deliberate way they approached set off every warning instinct he'd honed during his years as a marshal. "Emma," he called. "Stay inside." She emerged anyway, wiping her hands on her apron, and her face went pale when she recognized the lead rider. Benjamin Hartwell, flanked by 3 hard-looking men who wore their guns with the ease of frequent use. But it was the 4th man, hanging back slightly from the others, who made Caleb's blood run cold. Jack Morrison. Older now, greyer, but unmistakably the same man who'd served as Hartwell's enforcer in territorial disputes 15 years ago. The same man who'd been involved in at least 3 suspicious deaths that Caleb had never been able to prove. The same man who'd disappeared when Caleb had gotten too close to building a case against him. If Morrison was working for Hartwell, this was far worse than a simple land grab. The riders stopped 20 feet from the cabin, and Hartwell dismounted with theatrical courtesy. "Mrs. Crawford, Mr. Stone, I hope we're not intruding." "You are," Emma said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "You gave me 3 days, Mr. Hartwell. It's only been 1. I know, but I had some paperwork I wanted to show you. Thought it might expedite our arrangement." He pulled a document from his coat and held it out. "A deed of sale, signed by your late husband. He sold me this land 3 weeks before his death, settling his considerable debts." Emma snatched the paper from his hand, scanning it quickly. Caleb moved to her side, reading over her shoulder. The document looked official, proper stamps, legal language, and at the bottom a signature that did indeed appear to be Thomas Crawford's name. "This is a forgery," Emma said, but her voice wavered. "Thomas would never have sold without telling me. Men don't always tell their wives everything, especially when it comes to their failures." Hartwell's voice was falsely sympathetic. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Crawford, but the law is clear. The land is mine. I'm giving you until tomorrow morning to gather your belongings and leave peacefully." "Tomorrow? You said 3 days. I said 3 days before I'd remove you forcibly. I'm being generous by giving you until tomorrow to leave on your own terms." Hartwell's expression hardened. "Don't test my patience." Caleb stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his pistol. "That document is fake. The signature might be close, but I'm betting the dates don't match up. Thomas Crawford couldn't have sold this land 3 weeks before his death because he was working on it right up until the accident. And you know this how, Mr. Stone? Were you here?" Hartwell smiled coldly. "No. You were hiding in the mountains, running from your responsibilities. So forgive me if I don't put much stock in your theories." Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly with age and whiskey. "Caleb Stone. Been a long time, Marshal. Not a marshal anymore, Jack, and you should be in prison. Should be a lot of things. But here we are." Morrison's hand drifted toward his gun. "You planning on making trouble?" The moment stretched taut between them, dangerous and electric. Caleb calculated odds and angles, 4 of them, 2 of him and Emma wasn't armed. Even with his skills, this could go badly if guns were drawn. But Emma's voice cut through the tension. "Get off my land, all of you. I'll be consulting a lawyer about this supposed deed, and until I do, you have no legal right to be here." Hartwell laughed. "A lawyer? With what money, Mrs. Crawford? Legal proceedings cost money you don't have. And I suspect you'll find most lawyers in the territory reluctant to take on a case against me." He remounted his horse. "Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Crawford. Be gone by then, or my men will help you leave. And trust me, you won't enjoy their methods." The four men rode off, leaving Caleb and Emma standing in the yard, the forged deed still clutched in Emma's shaking hands. As soon as they were out of sight, Emma's composure crumbled. How did he get Thomas's signature? How is this possible? Caleb took the document, studying it more carefully. The paper was new, too new for a document supposedly signed 6 months ago. The ink was fresh. But the signature, that was the troubling part. It wasn't just similar to Thomas's hand, it was nearly perfect. "Someone who knew Thomas signed this," Caleb said slowly. "Someone who had access to his papers, who could practice his signature until they got it right." But who would do that? Thomas had no enemies. Everyone liked him. Everyone except Hartwell, apparently. Caleb's mind was racing, pieces clicking together. How many widows live in this territory, Emma? Women alone. With land? Emma thought for a moment. At least a dozen that I know of. More if you count the whole territory. And how many of them have had similar problems with Hartwell? Claims of debt, pressure to sell. Emma's eyes widened. There was Martha Jensen, lost her husband 2 years ago, and Hartwell bought her land. She said it was voluntary, but... She paused. And before that, Ruth Morrison, no relation to Jack, thank God. She lost her farm to debt collection. Both to Hartwell? Both to Hartwell. Caleb felt the old martial instincts taking over, the methodical assembly of evidence and pattern recognition that had made him good at his job. He's running a scheme. Target widows, forge documents or manufacture debts, force them off their land, then consolidate the properties and sell them for profit. But how do we prove it? That was the question. The forged deed was good, so good that without expert analysis it might stand up in court. And Emma had no resources to fight a legal battle, no money for lawyers or investigators. By the time they could mount a proper challenge, Hartwell would have taken possession and the land would be lost. Unless Morrison, Caleb said suddenly. Jack Morrison. I recognized him. Who is he? A killer, or close enough. Worked as an enforcer for various land speculators 15 years ago. I was building a case against him when Sarah died, when I left the marshal's office. Caleb began pacing, his mind working furiously. If Morrison is involved, this isn't just land fraud. This is bigger, more organized, maybe even violent. Thomas died in a logging accident, Emma said slowly, her face draining of color. But what if... Don't, Caleb said sharply. Don't go down that path until we know more. But yes, we need to consider all possibilities. They spent the rest of the morning searching through Thomas's belongings, looking for anything that might help prove the deed was forged. Emma produced a few letters Thomas had written, samples of his handwriting that clearly didn't match the signature on the deed. The slant was wrong, the formation of certain letters different. It was evidence, but would it be enough? As afternoon approached, Caleb made a decision. I need to ride to the territorial capital. There's someone there who can help if he's still in his position. Who? Judge Marcus Morrison, Jack's older brother, though they've been estranged for 20 years. He was appointed territorial judge about the time I left the marshal's service. If anyone can expedite an investigation into Hartwell's activities, it's him. That's 3 days' hard ride, Caleb. You won't be back before Hartwell's deadline. I know, but it's our best chance. He gripped her shoulders gently. Emma, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She searched his face, then nodded. What should I do while you're gone? Gather evidence. Talk to the other widows if you can. Find out if anyone else has had problems with Hartwell. Look for witnesses who can testify to Thomas's ownership, who remember when he bought this land and paid for it. A minister, maybe, or the land office clerk. Anyone. And if Hartwell comes back? Caleb pulled out his spare pistol, checked that it was loaded, and handed it to Emma. You know how to use one of these? Thomas taught me. I'm not a great shot, but I'm adequate. Don't be afraid to fire it. Better to shoot and ask questions later than to end up dead." He paused, then added, "I'll be back, Emma, I promise. Just hold them off until I return. What if you can't make it back in time? Then you do what you have to do to survive. Run if you must, hide if you can, but whatever you do, don't let them take you alive. Men like Morrison don't leave witnesses." The fear in Emma's eyes nearly broke him, but Caleb couldn't afford to be gentle. She needed to understand the danger, needed to be prepared for the worst. He spent the next hour preparing for the journey, checking Dust's shoes, packing light but sufficient supplies, making sure his rifle was clean and his ammunition plentiful. Emma watched silently, her arms crossed, clearly trying to maintain her composure. As the sun began to set, Caleb was ready to ride, but before he could mount, Emma crossed to him and took his hands in hers. "Come back to me," she said simply. "Whatever happens, promise me you'll come back." Caleb wanted to promise, wanted to guarantee that everything would work out, that justice would prevail, that they'd have their happy ending. But he'd been a lawman long enough to know that life rarely offered such certainties. Instead, he pulled Emma close and kissed her a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of all the things he couldn't put into words. The caring he felt for her, the hope she'd given him, the future he wanted but didn't dare promise. When they parted, Emma's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That's not a promise, Caleb Stone. It's the best I can offer." "But Emma," he cupped her face in his hands, "if something happens to me, if I don't make it back, don't stay here. Don't try to fight Hartwell alone. Take the horses and whatever you can carry and ride for your sister's place. Live to fight another day. I'm not leaving. This is my home. Thomas's dream. I won't abandon it." Emma: "No, Caleb. You don't get to ask me to give up when you've spent the last weeks teaching me to stand and fight." Her voice was firm, determined. "I'll be here when you get back. And if Hartwell comes before then, I'll deal with him." There was no point arguing. Caleb recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, the steel in her spine. She'd made her choice, and nothing he said would change her mind. "Then hold the cabin," he said. "Bar the door, keep the gun close, and trust no one except me." He mounted Dust and looked back one last time at Emma, standing in front of the cabin they'd repaired together. She looked small and vulnerable in the fading light, but Caleb knew better. She was strong, stronger than Hartwell could imagine, stronger than circumstances had any right to make her. "3 days," he called. "I'll be back in 3 days or less." Then he turned Dust northeast and rode hard into the gathering darkness, racing against time and fate and the machinations of men who preyed on the vulnerable. Behind him, Emma watched until he disappeared from sight, then turned back to the cabin with grim determination. She had preparations to make. And if Benjamin Hartwell thought she'd be an easy target just because Caleb was gone, he was in for a very unpleasant surprise. The game, as they said, was afoot, and neither side was willing to yield without a fight. Caleb rode through the night, pushing Dust as hard as he dared without risking injury to the mare. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate by, and the trail to the territorial capital was one he'd traveled many times during his years as a marshal. His body remembered the rhythm, even if his mind had tried to forget. As the miles passed beneath Dust's hooves, Caleb's thoughts churned. He was taking an enormous risk, leaving Emma alone, but without official intervention, they had no hope of stopping Hartwell legally. And Caleb knew from bitter experience that taking the law into his own hands would only make things worse, would turn him into the criminal and Hartwell into the victim. Judge Marcus Morrison was their best chance. Marcus was scrupulously honest, one of the few territorial judges who couldn't be bought or intimidated. He and his brother Jack had followed very different paths in life, and Marcus took particular offense at corruption that sullied the legal system he dedicated his life to upholding. If Caleb could reach him, explain the situation, and provide enough evidence to warrant investigation, Marcus would act swiftly. The judge had the authority to issue emergency injunctions, to freeze land transfers pending investigation, to dispatch territorial marshals if necessary. But 3 days was an optimistic estimate. The capital was 80 miles northeast, through terrain that varied from flat prairie to rocky hills. If Caleb pushed hard, stopping only to rest dust and grab a few hours of sleep himself, he might make it in 2.5 days. That would give him half a day to meet with Marcus, present his case, and secure whatever legal instruments were needed. Then another 2.5 days back, arriving just as Hartwell's deadline expired. It was possible. Barely. The first day passed in a blur of motion and determination. Caleb stopped only twice, once to water dust at a creek he knew, and again, around midday, to let the mare graze while he chewed on dried meat and hardtack. He tried not to think about Emma alone at the cabin, tried not to imagine Hartwell deciding to move up his timeline, tried not to picture Morrison's cold eyes as he threatened her. But the images came anyway, uninvited and unwelcome. By nightfall, Caleb had covered nearly 40 miles. He made camp in a small canyon that offered shelter from the wind and a modicum of concealment. He didn't light a fire too risky, too visible. Instead, he rolled himself in his blanket and tried to sleep, his body exhausted but his mind refusing to quiet. He thought about Sarah, about the life they'd had and the dreams that had died with her. For so long, those memories had been nothing but pain, sharp edges that cut whenever he got too close. But now, lying under the stars with Emma's safety weighing on his mind, he found he could think of Sarah with something approaching peace. She would have liked Emma, he thought, would have recognized the same strength and determination that had defined Sarah's own character, would have understood why Caleb had finally stopped running, why he'd chosen to stand and fight for something that mattered. And Sarah would have wanted him to be happy. He knew that, with bone-deep certainty. Whatever else she'd been, Sarah had been generous with her love, quick to forgive, always looking for the good in people. She wouldn't want him to spend the rest of his life alone and grieving. She'd want him to live fully, to love again, to find purpose and connection. The realization brought tears to Caleb's eyes, not tears of grief, but of release. He pulled out the wooden box that held Sarah's belongings, opened it in the moonlight, and looked at each item one last time. Then, gently, he closed it and tucked it away. Not discarding it, not forgetting, but acknowledging that it was time to let his present and future mean as much as his past. "Thank you," he whispered to Sarah's memory, "for everything, for loving me, for showing me what it meant to build a life with someone, for being patient with my grief all these years." He paused, searching for the right words. "I think I'm ready now, ready to move forward, ready to open my heart again. I hope you understand. I hope, wherever you are, you're at peace." The night offered no answer, but Caleb felt lighter nonetheless. He slept fitfully for a few hours, then rose before dawn to continue his journey. The second day was harder. Dust was tiring, and Caleb had to slow their pace to avoid breaking the mare down. He traded speed for steadiness, maintaining a ground-eating trot that covered miles without exhausting his mount. Around midday, he stopped at a small settlement, barely more than a trading post, and a few scattered buildings to buy grain for dust and fresh provisions for himself. The trader, a grizzled man named Silas, recognized Caleb immediately. "Stone, that you? Hell, I thought you were dead. Heard you'd gone into the mountains and never came out." "Still alive, Silas. Need supplies, and I'm in a hurry." Always were a man of few words. Silas gathered the requested items, eyeing Caleb with curiosity. "What's got you riding so hard? You look like you're racing the devil himself." "Close enough." "How far to the capital from here?" 40 miles, give or take. "You planning to get there today?" "Hoping to arrive by tomorrow morning." Silas whistled. "That's ambitious. You'll kill your horse." "She'll make it. She's tougher than she looks." As Caleb paid for the supplies, Silas leaned across the counter. Word of advice, Stone. Whatever trouble you're heading toward, think twice. Man like you, been out of the game for years. It's not like riding a bicycle. Takes time to get your edge back. Some things you never forget. Maybe, but some things forget you. Just watch yourself. Caleb thanked him and continued on, but Silas's words nagged at him. Was he being foolish, trying to reclaim a role he'd abandoned 15 years ago? He wasn't a marshal anymore. Wasn't even sure he was the same man who'd worn that badge with such confidence. But then he thought of Emma, and doubt evaporated. This wasn't about being a marshal or reclaiming past glory. This was about protecting someone he cared about from people who would hurt her without a second thought. That didn't require a badge or official authority. It just required determination and a willingness to do what was necessary. He rode through the afternoon and into the evening, finally stopping when darkness made further travel dangerous. He was close now, maybe 20 miles from the capital. If he left before dawn, he could arrive by mid-morning, conduct his business, and start back by afternoon. That night, sleep came easier. Caleb was exhausted down to his bones, and even worry couldn't keep him awake for long. He dreamed of the cabin, of Emma standing in the doorway with sunlight behind her, of a future that felt tantalizingly possible if he could just move fast enough, be smart enough, protect what mattered. He woke to find snow falling light, dry flakes that wouldn't amount to much but signaled winter's approach. The season was changing. Soon the plains would be impassable, the mountains locked in by deep snow. Whatever happened with Hartwell, it needed to happen soon. Emma couldn't survive a winter alone in that cabin without proper supplies and preparation. Caleb reached the territorial capital just after 9 in the morning. It was a substantial town by frontier standards, nearly 1,500 people, with proper streets, multiple shops, a territorial office building, and a courthouse that doubled as the judge's chambers. Caleb tied dust outside the courthouse and climbed the stone steps with weary determination. Inside, a clerk looked up from his paperwork with obvious surprise. "Can I help you?" "I need to see Judge Morrison. It's urgent." "The judge is in session. He won't be available until this afternoon at the earliest." "This can't wait. People's lives are at stake." The clerk's expression shifted from mild annoyance to concern. "What's the nature of the emergency?" "Land fraud. Possibly murder. A woman is in danger right now, and I need the judge's authority to intervene. I'll see what I can do." "Your name?" "Caleb Stone. Tell him I was a territorial marshal under his jurisdiction 15 years ago." The clerk's eyebrows rose, but he nodded and disappeared through a door behind his desk. Minutes crawled by. Caleb paced the small waiting area, every nerve on edge. He was close now, so close to getting the help they needed. But every minute delayed was another minute. Emma was alone and vulnerable. Finally the door opened and the clerk emerged. "Judge Morrison will see you immediately. Third door on the right." Caleb didn't waste time thanking him. He strode down the indicated hallway and knocked once before entering. Judge Marcus Morrison looked up from his desk, and recognition flashed across his weathered face. He was in his 60s now, silver-haired and dignified, but his eyes were as sharp as Caleb remembered. "Caleb Stone. I'd heard rumors you were still alive, but I didn't quite believe them." Marcus stood and extended his hand. "It's been a long time. Too long, Your Honor, and I wish I were here for a social call, but I'm not. So I gathered. Have a seat and tell me what's brought you down from your mountain hermitage." Caleb sat and laid out the situation as concisely as possible. Emma's land, Thomas's death, Hartwell's forged deed, the presence of Jack Morrison, the pattern of similar cases involving other widows. He produced the forged deed and the samples of Thomas's handwriting Emma had provided, explaining the discrepancies. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When Caleb finished, the judge sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "My brother," he said quietly, "I should have known Jack would surface eventually. I'd hoped prison had reformed him, but a leopard doesn't change its spots. Prison? When was Jack in prison? 10 years ago. I personally tried the case cattle rustling and assault. He served 7 years, got out on good behavior 3 years ago. I've had people keeping tabs on him, but he's been careful. No obvious criminal activity. Until now. Until now, Marcus agreed. Though if what you're telling me is accurate, he's been very careful about covering his tracks. This Hartwell fellow is the front man, and Jack provides the muscle and intimidation in the background. Can you help? Can you issue an injunction freezing the land transfer? Marcus was already reaching for paper and pen. I can do better than that. I'm issuing a warrant for Hartwell's arrest on suspicion of fraud and forgery. I'm also issuing a warrant for Jack, though that one's for parole violation. He's not supposed to be within 50 miles of any active land transaction. He began writing rapidly. And I'm deputizing you temporarily as a territorial marshal with full authority to serve these warrants and maintain order until proper law enforcement can arrive. Caleb felt something click into place inside him. His old marshal's badge might be long gone, but the authority, the responsibility, the purpose, all came flooding back. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet. Jack's dangerous, and if Hartwell is as ruthless as you describe, this could get bloody. Marcus looked up from his writing. Are you prepared for that possibility? I am, if I have to be, but I'd rather do this legally by the book. Good man. That's why I'm trusting you with this. Marcus finished writing, affixed his seal, and handed Caleb 3 documents, the warrants, and his temporary marshal credentials. These are valid for 30 days or until a permanent marshal can be assigned to the case, whichever comes first. Use them wisely, Caleb, and watch yourself. Jack always was a snake, and from what you're telling me, he's only gotten more venomous with age. Caleb tucked the documents carefully into his coat. There's one more thing. Emma Crawford, the woman whose land is being stolen, she's alone right now, defending her property against men who won't hesitate to hurt her. I need to get back as fast as possible. How long did it take you to get here? 2.5 days, pushing hard. Marcus considered. I can provide you with a fresh horse. My personal mount is stabled 2 blocks over. He's fast and strong, and he can get you back faster than your current animal. He scribbled a quick note. Give this to my stableman. Tell him I said it's an emergency. I can't take your horse, Your Honor. You can, and you will. This isn't a favor, Caleb. It's pragmatism. The faster you get back, the faster this situation gets resolved, and the less chance there is of violence. Marcus stood, his expression stern. Now go. Ride hard, and when this is over, come back and tell me how it went. I want to know that justice was served. Caleb shook the judge's hand one more time, feeling the weight of responsibility and authority settle back onto his shoulders like an old familiar coat. I will, Your Honor, and thank you for trusting me, for remembering who I used to be. You're still that man, Caleb, you just forgot for a while. Marcus smiled slightly. Now go save that woman's land. And perhaps, if I'm reading the situation correctly, save a bit more than just her land. Caleb felt his face warm, but didn't deny it. Marcus had always been perceptive. I'll do my best. Within the hour, Caleb was on the road back to Emma's cabin, riding Marcus's powerful black gelding and carrying the legal authority to make things right. The documents in his coat were more than just paper. They were power, legitimacy, the law's backing against the lawless. But as he rode, Caleb couldn't shake a growing sense of urgency. Emma was alone. Hartwell was impatient. And Jack Morrison was a wild card who might decide to take matters into his own hands rather than wait for his employer's schedule. Caleb pushed the gelding hard, racing the clock and his own fears. He'd made it to the capital in 2.5 days. With Marcus's fresh horse, he might make it back in 2. He had to. Because if something happened to Emma while he was gone, if Hartwell hurt her or worse, all the legal authority in the world wouldn't matter. Some losses were permanent, some wounds never healed. And Caleb Stone had already lost too much to survive, losing Emma too. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Emma had dozed fitfully through the night, waking at every sound, real or imagined. Now, with morning light spilling across the plains, she stood at the window and watched the horizon for signs of riders. They came as the sun cleared the distant hills, 4 riders, moving with purpose rather than haste. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she checked Thomas's rifle one final time. She positioned herself at the window, door barred, shutters latched on, all but the one opening she'd use for firing. The riders stopped at the same distance as before, and Hartwell called out, "Mrs. Crawford, this is your last chance. Leave peacefully, and you'll come to no harm." Emma didn't bother responding. They both knew how this would end. Hartwell conferred briefly with his men, then Morrison and the other 2 began to fan out, clearly preparing to surround the cabin. Emma tracked Morrison with her rifle. He was the real threat, the professional among them. If shooting started, he'd be the first target. "Mrs. Crawford," Hartwell tried again, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. "Don't be foolish. You can't win this." "Maybe not," Emma called back, "but I can make it cost you." Morrison laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Boss, we're wasting time. Let me burn her out." "No," Hartwell said sharply. "I want the cabin intact. Go in and get her. Just don't kill her unless you have to. A dead widow would bring questions I'd rather not answer." Emma's blood ran cold. They were coming in. She tightened her grip on the rifle, sighting down the barrel at Morrison as he dismounted and began walking toward the cabin with casual confidence. 50 yards. 40. 30. Emma's finger touched the trigger. She'd never shot a person before, had never wanted to. But Morrison's cold eyes and predatory smile made the choice easier. This man would hurt her without hesitation, would violate everything Thomas had built, would destroy all that she'd fought to preserve. 20 yards. Emma took a breath, let it out slowly, and began to squeeze. The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the morning air, and Morrison jerked to a stop, but it wasn't Emma who'd fired. A second shot kicked up dirt at Morrison's feet, and he dove for cover behind a small rise. What the hell? Hartwell spun his horse, searching for the source of the shots. Then Emma saw him, Caleb, riding hard from the north, rifle in hand, the morning sun behind him turning him into a dark silhouette against the sky. He fired again, this time clearly aiming high as a warning, and his voice carried across the plains with martial authority. "Benjamin Hartwell, Jack Morrison, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and attempted theft. By order of Judge Marcus Morrison, Territorial Court, throw down your weapons." Emma's heart soared, even as her mind struggled to process Caleb's words. Under arrest, by order of the judge. How had he managed that in just 2 days? Hartwell's face went purple with rage. "You've got no authority here, Stone. You're not a marshal anymore." Caleb pulled his horse to a stop 30 yards from the cabin, positioning himself between Emma and Hartwell's men. He reached into his coat and pulled out a document, holding it high. "Temporary Territorial Marshal, deputized by Judge Morrison yesterday morning. These warrants are legal and binding." He urged his horse forward a few steps. "Jack Morrison, you're also in violation of your parole terms. You know what that means." Morrison's head popped up from behind the rise, his expression a mixture of fury and calculation. "I ain't going back to prison, Caleb. Not for this. Not for anything." "Then don't make me kill you, Jack. Put down the gun and come in peacefully." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Emma watched from the window, Caleb sat steady on his horse, and Morrison crouched behind his inadequate cover, weighing his options. The 2 other men looked to Hartwell for guidance, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Then Morrison moved. He came up fast, gun raised, not toward Caleb but toward the cabin, toward Emma. Caleb's rifle cracked once, and Morrison spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. "Anyone else?" Caleb's voice was cold as winter. Any other man here wants to test whether I've lost my edge?" The two hired guns looked at each other, then at Hartwell, then at Caleb. Slowly, carefully, they raised their hands. "Smart choice," Caleb said. "Throw your guns down. All of you. Hartwell, that includes you." Hartwell's face was a mask of impotent rage, but he complied, tossing his pistol to the ground. "This isn't over, Stone. I have lawyers. I have connections. That deed is legal, and you know it. The deed is a forgery, and I have handwriting samples to prove it." Caleb dismounted, keeping his rifle trained on the group. "I also have testimony from 6 other widows that you've run this scheme on before. Judge Morrison is very interested in hearing all about your business practices." Emma emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, and crossed to Caleb's side. Their eyes met, and in that moment 1,000 words passed between them without being spoken. "You came back," Emma said softly. "I promised I would." "That wasn't exactly a promise. It is now." Behind them, Morrison groaned in pain, and Hartwell cursed under his breath. But Emma and Caleb barely noticed. The battle was over. The war was won. And standing together in the morning light, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd fought for, both of them understood that they'd found something worth more than land or law or victory. They'd found each other. And that changed everything. 3 weeks had passed since that cold dawn when Caleb rode in with warrants and authority, turning what could have been tragedy into triumph. The territorial marshal who'd arrived 2 days later had taken Hartwell, Morrison, and the hired guns into custody, transporting them to the capital for trial. Judge Morrison had personally overseen the proceedings, and the evidence, both the forged deed and testimony from multiple victims, had been overwhelming. Hartwell was sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy. Jack Morrison, with his parole violation added to new charges of assault and attempted extortion, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The hired guns, offered leniency for their testimony against their employers, received lighter sentences but would serve time nonetheless. Justice, it seemed, had finally caught up with Benjamin Hartwell's schemes. For Emma, the ordeal's resolution brought more than legal vindication. The Territorial Land Office had officially recorded her ownership, issuing a proper deed that no one could challenge. But more than that, the other widows Hartwell had victimized had begun the process of reclaiming their stolen properties. Some of the land was lost forever, sold to innocent third parties who couldn't be dispossessed, but much of it would return to its rightful owners, and restitution was being arranged for the rest. It was a good outcome, as outcomes went. Not perfect, nothing ever was on the frontier, but good enough, fair enough, just enough. Now, as Emma stood on the cabin's new porch, the one Caleb had finally finished building, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. The cabin that had been half-collapsed ruins was now solid and complete, smoke rising steadily from its chimney, curtains Emma had sewn hanging in the windows. The land that had nearly been stolen was hers, legally and beyond question. And the life she'd thought ended with Thomas's death had somehow found new purpose, new direction, new hope. Caleb emerged from the barn carrying an armload of firewood, and Emma felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He'd stayed, as she'd known he would, not from obligation or duty, but from choice, from desire, from the slow-growing love that had taken root between them during those weeks of working side by side. They hadn't rushed into anything. Both of them carried too much history, too much grief, to move carelessly into the future. But they'd talked. Long conversations by firelight about Sarah and Thomas, about loss and healing, about what it meant to honor the past while embracing the present. They'd found common ground in their scars, comfort in their shared understanding of what it meant to survive loss and find the courage to risk caring again. "Thinking deep thoughts?" Caleb asked as he stacked the wood beside the door. "Just counting my blessings. Find many, more than I expected." Emma smiled at him, considerably more. Caleb crossed to her side, and they stood together looking out across the land that was truly Emma's now, land that represented not just Thomas's dream, but the future she and Caleb were beginning to build together. "I was thinking," Caleb said carefully, "winter's coming. Snow will be here within a month, and while this cabin's solid, it's small for two people living together long term." Emma's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice light. "Is that so? Could add a room, come spring, maybe two. There's good timber in the hills, and I know my way around a saw." He paused. "If you were agreeable to it, to expanding the cabin, to me staying permanently, not as a hired hand or a helper, but as—" He stopped, searching for words. "As your partner, in all ways." Emma turned to face him fully, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope he was trying not to show too obviously. This man who'd spent 15 years alone, who'd hidden from life and connection, was offering her everything. His present, his future, his carefully guarded heart. "Caleb Stone," she said softly, "are you asking me to let you stay? I'm asking if you'll have me. Not to replace Thomas, that wouldn't be right or even possible, but to build something new with you, something that honors what we've both lost while creating what we both need." Emma reached up and cupped his weathered face in her hands. "I started falling for you the moment you picked up that hammer. You know that, don't you? I hoped. Wasn't sure. I'm sure. I'm sure. I want you here, not just for winter, but for all the seasons to come. I'm sure that what we have is real and right, and worth building a life around." She paused, then added, "But Caleb, I need to know you're not staying out of obligation. Not because you feel you have to protect me or finish what Thomas started. I need to know you're staying because you want to, because this is where you choose to be." Caleb pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm staying because when I think about riding back to those mountains, back to that solitary existence, I feel empty. But when I think about staying here with you, about building a life together, about watching seasons change and years pass with you beside me," his voice caught. "Emma, you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose, connection, the ability to feel joy instead of just absence. Because I want to wake up every morning and see your face. Because I want to build that room addition and plant a garden and raise horses and maybe, if we're blessed, have a family of our own someday." Tears streamed down Emma's face, but they were tears of happiness, not grief. "Then stay, Caleb Stone. Stay and build this life with me. Stay and help me turn Thomas's dream into our reality. Stay and show me every day what it means to choose love, even when life has given you every reason not to." They kissed then, gentle and deep, sealing the promise between them. And when they parted, both were smiling through their tears. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Caleb pulled out his wooden cedar box one final time. Emma watched as he opened it, taking out each of Sarah's belongings and holding them with reverence. "I need to let these go," he said quietly. "Not forget them or discard them, but find a proper place for them. Sarah deserves better than to be carried around in a box while I use her memory as a shield against living." Emma took his hand. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a place near my old homestead, a hill where Sarah loved to watch sunsets. I'd like to bury these things there, mark the spot with stones, give her a proper memorial." He looked at Emma. "Would you come with me? I don't want to do this alone, but I also don't want to do it without honoring her properly." "Of course I'll come. Sarah's part of your story, part of what made you who you are. I would never ask you to forget her or pretend she didn't matter." 2 days later, they made the journey to Caleb's old homestead. Together they climbed the hill Sarah had loved, and there, with Emma beside him, Caleb buried the wooden box. They marked the spot with a circle of stones, and Caleb spoke words of love and gratitude and goodbye. Not a permanent goodbye. Sarah would always be part of him. But a goodbye to the grief that had imprisoned him, the pain that had defined his existence for too long. "Thank you," he whispered to Sarah's memory, "for everything you gave me, for showing me what love could be, for being patient while I learned how to live again. Rest easy now, I'm going to be all right. We both are." As they rode back to the cabin to home, Caleb felt lighter than he had in 15 years. The weight of guilt and grief hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more bearable, something that informed his present without imprisoning it. Emma reached across the space between their horses and took his hand, and Caleb held on tight, grateful beyond words for second chances and new beginnings, and the courage to let himself be found. The cabin came into view as the sun began to set, smoke rising from its chimney, solid and welcoming against the vast prairie sky. It looked like home. It felt like home. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb knew with absolute certainty that home was exactly where he was meant to be. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever. Sometimes all it takes is one person who decides to stop and help. Caleb Stone had stopped because something in Emma's determination reminded him of everything he'd lost, but what he'd found was so much more not a replacement for what had been, but something entirely new. A second chance at happiness, a reminder that life, however harsh and unforgiving, still held moments of grace. And standing together on that porch, watching the sun set over land that was legally and truly theirs, both Emma and Caleb understood that the hardest part of their journey was behind them. Winter would come, and it would be harsh. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, moments of doubt and difficulty, but they would face them together.